Okay. My name is Larry Kidder, and I live in Ewing Township, not too far away. And I'm a retired history teacher, and I do a lot of work at Powell Living History Farm, if you all know that, in Hopewell Township, not far from you. And I've, in retirement, been doing a lot of research and writing, particularly on the American Revolution in what's now Hunterdon and Mercer County. And that's how my interest in Jacob Francis first originated. And working with me today is Ken Hawkins, who I've gotten to know, and we're now good friends because he is also interested in Jacob Francis from a different perspective. And I'm going to let him share that with you when I turn it over to him. But we're going to actually be looking at two generations of a family that were associated with your church. And in their story, I think it's a story not only of them as congregants of the church, but also just the experience of African Americans, Black people during the time that they lived, and the obstacles that they had to overcome, and the opportunities that they had at some times. So with that as introduction, I will put the screen on here for and can everybody see the screen now?
Yes.
Everybody see the title? Okay. Yeah, Jim mentioned that he and other people were at the church evaluating some things. I think he said about the roof, and that was the first time I had been on the church property, and I was there to see if I could locate the grave of Jacob Francis. I knew that he died in 1836, and I knew that he was buried in your church because I'd been up to the Hunterdon County Historical Society just up the road from you. Not knowing whether to be able to find it or not, I knew that Ken was going to be coming up to this area, so we've agreed to kind of explore the cemetery together. Now, you all recognize this picture, right? You know exactly where it is. And you know the handicap parking spots right here. And if you parked in the handicapped spot furthest down here, you were looking right at tombstones of Jacob and Mary Francis.
Oh, right there.
They're right at the front of the cemetery. And I don't know if any of you ever noticed those names before, or if you saw them, if you wondered, who the heck these people were. Not real clear anymore, but there's a little bit closer to them, so you can see the names Jacob Francis on the left and Mary, the wife of Jacob Francis. You know how women were, at this time they're identified by their husband and all of that, even in the cemetery. And again, you can see that the information on the tombstones is not all that clear anymore. It has gotten weathered away in a lot of cases. And you can't see the date, for example, is just in the grass there. July 26th, 1836 is when he died. Mary died in 1844, and a little bit more about that. And also, further back in the cemetery, some more, a little bit more modern, late 19th century tombstones are from the same family. Nathaniel was a son of Mary and Jacob, and he married Hannah. And the tombstones right behind them are a couple of their children also. I want you to remember that name Nathaniel as a son, because it's going to play a part in the story that might be a little unsuspected. Okay. Now remember that with Jacob and Mary, with Jacob, you have a veteran of the American Revolution, and with Mary, you have a freed slave. So you've got a couple of very interesting stories going on there among the Black population. Now, just to get back to the very beginning, Jacob was born on January 15th, 1754, somewhere in Amwell Township, which was really big at that time. It was both East and West Amwell. It was a giant township. Have no idea what his mother's name was. We do know that she was free and not a slave at the time that he was born. and we have no idea who his father is. And likewise, we have no idea if he had any brothers and sisters. He gives brief information about his family later on in life, and he only mentions his mother as a Black woman and says nothing about a father, nothing about siblings, which I find kind of interesting. He obviously was born into a farming culture, and one of the types of labor that farmers could get hold of, in addition to slaves, were indentured servants. I hope you understand that an indentured servant was kind of a slave for a short period of time. The best example of indentured servants was when white immigrants came over from Europe in the 18th century and couldn't pay for their passage on the ship. So when they got to America, whichever port they got to, the captain of the ship would sell them to somebody in that town who would pay for their passage. And they might sell them for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 7 years, whatever it was. And then the person would be free after that time. Now, these are white people for the most part, not Black. Now, Jacob, as a young boy, is going to be sold, his time is going to be sold by his mother to a local farmer until Jacob gets to be 21. Now, why she would bind him out to as an indentured servant, we don't know. Could she just not take care of him? Did she want a better opportunity for him? Did she want him to maybe learn to read and write with one of these farmers? We just don't know. But we do know the names of the people because Jacob recorded them later in life. There's no records of when this happened. His first owner of his time was Jacob Wambaugh, and he was in Amwell Township. And he owned him only for a short period of time and then sold his time to Michael Hart, who was also a local farmer. Then, months or years later, the time remaining on his indenture was sold to Mr. Gulick, a person of Dutch ancestry, who I believe was in Hopewell Township, who then sold him to a man named Joseph Saxton, who was not local, but took him as a servant to New York and Long Island, and then transferred him all the way to the West Indies, to St. John in the Caribbean. And then finally, in 1768, November of 1768, they landed in Salem, Massachusetts. So Jacob's getting around here. Once they got to Salem, a man named Benjamin DeLand purchased the remaining 6 years of his indenture, and Jacob settled down now and lived with the DeLand family in Salem between 1768 and 1775. Now, think about those dates, 1768 to 1775, and what's going on in the world, and particularly what's going on in Massachusetts, very near Boston. And here's our young man Jacob in his teenage years, coming up to age 20, just at the time that the revolution is breaking out all around him. We do know that the DeLand family was very much involved with the Patriot cause. Benjamin DeLand got into a little bit of problem with the Patriots over non-importation, but he worked his way out of that. And he was in the militia. He was in all kinds of revolutionary groups. So Jacob grew up with that all around him. When his time of freedom came on January 15, 1775, here he is. He's no longer in New Jersey. He hasn't been home for a decade or more. He's gotten settled in at Salem. And what's he going to do? Well, apparently he looked for work during the months between January and October. During the time that he's living there is the battles of Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill. Men from Salem, militiamen from Salem are going to those battles and coming back. The son of a brother of his owner, his time owner, Benjamin Dalen, was actually killed at the battle, or at the Lexington engagement. So he knew people who were involved in this very well. And then in late October, since he hasn't found any permanent job, he doesn't have family in the area, he enlisted for a year in the Continental Army at Cambridge, just outside of Boston. Now, in October 1775, the war is going on. The British Army is under siege in Boston by Washington's army surrounding the town. And this is when Jacob enlists. It's also important to know that Washington did not want blacks in the army at this time. He was doing everything he could to keep free blacks and certainly enslaved men, but even free blacks out of the army. We think Joseph enlisted about October 31st because he, and later on said it was the last day of October. And on that very day, Washington issued an order to his troops and to the officers saying, do not enlist a black man. So the very day that he enlisted, Washington was ordering his officers not to enlist him. But he got in anyway. Staying in was going to be an issue because Washington kept following up with additional orders, and Jacob must have felt at any point he could have been just kicked out of the army because he was black, not because of anything else. It wasn't going to be until the end of December, 2 months after he enlisted, that Washington finally gave in and told his officers they could enlist free blacks. The reason being they couldn't get enough white people to join. And they also were worried that the British were trying to attract free blacks to join the British Army. So they were letting down their resistance to black enlistment. But anyway, he enlisted in John Wiley's company in Sergeant's 16th Continental Regiment, which was all Massachusetts and New Hampshire men who signed on for that 1 year. He's actually going to serve 14 months because he served, his enlistment really started January 1st, 1776, but he joined, like, let's say November 1st, so he had 2 months. So he served for 14 months altogether. He served at the Siege of Boston until the British left in March of 1776. Then he went to the New York campaign and fought around, the Long Island, Manhattan, White Plains, all of those battles, and then the retreat across New Jersey. So he was ready with Washington's army. He had joined Washington's army with the forces that had been under General Lee and were now under General Sullivan. And he's going to be one of the guys in one of those boats, all right? Not necessarily the boat with Washington, but one of those boats that got the men across before the Battle of Trenton. I think it's worth noting that there were hardly any New Jersey men at the Battle of Trenton because there were no New Jersey regiments in the Continental Army who fought at the Battle of Trenton. You had to be, a New Jersey guy in a Massachusetts regiment or something like that to have been at the Battle of Trenton. When they crossed the river and then marched to Trenton, as you see the arrows here, the black arrow, a little bit below the white arrows, shows the route of Sullivan's division that broke off, if you know the little crossroads at West Trenton. Now it's taking back the name Birmingham in some ways, but that's where the army split to attack Trenton from two different directions. And Jacob went with the one that was going to the southern part of Trenton, and that attacked down near where the Trenton barracks are, down on State Street area, coming across Warren and Broad Street. Then they crossed over at Mill Hill Park. They crossed the Assunpink Creek, and they were actually, they fought in town. They fought right in this area against some Hessians, and then they came and crossed over and observed the Hessians surrendering right in this area. So he participated in the battle and also was an eyewitness to the Hessian surrender. Now, a couple of days after the Battle of Trenton on December 26, 1776, his enlistment is up. on December 31st. So he's like 5 days away from his enlistment expiring at the Battle of Trenton. You know that there's some battles after that, you know, at Princeton and places like that within a few days. Well, most of Washington's army was going to leave him, including Jacob. So Washington offered his troops a $10 bonus and an additional 6 weeks of pay if they would just extend their enlistment for 6 weeks. By the way, a $10 bonus was like a month's pay. It wasn't a low amount. It was a solid amount. However, at this point, Jacob was already owed 7.5 months of pay that the Continental Congress hadn't put up there for him, along with everybody else who was, owed pay. He'd been through a number of battles. He'd been through a lot of illness, not him personally, but in his regiment. His regiment was so depleted that he was just one of a very few people left after the end of that year. As far as he was concerned, the Continental Congress hadn't lived up to its part of the enlistment bargain. They hadn't fed him right. They hadn't clothed him right. They hadn't paid him right. All of those things, but they'd expected him to do his job 100%. So like a lot of men, he decided not to extend his enlistment and went home instead. He was verbally discharged. Continental Army wasn't in condition enough to actually discharge men properly. And he was only given 3 months back pay, not the 7.5 that he was owed. They told him, we'll get it to you sometime, no problem. So here he is in Trenton, and he's about 15 miles from where he left Mom so many years ago. I think that's one of the main reasons he didn't extend. He wanted to find Mom. And when he found Mom, he wanted to find her because he didn't know his family name. He had enlisted under the name of one of the men who had owned his time, an indenture, because he didn't know his real name. But when he got to find his mom, she told him the name was Frances. Now, the document that I have up here on the screen is literally his application for a pension as a Revolutionary War veteran that he did in the 1800s, when he's remembering and telling his story in order to qualify for a pension. So these are his words that were taken by a court and recorded for him. So now he's out of the Army. He's about 23 years old, and he wants to get a settled life. He was very industrious, and within 3 years, he did something very unusual for a free black man. He bought land. He had 46 acres in Amwell Township, and this is very unusual. The tax records from the time show him as the only free black man owning land in Amwell Township, and only one of 2 free black men even listed. The other black man had different kind of property than physical land that he was on the tax list for. He signed into the local militia company. Captain Philip Snook of the 3rd Hunterdon Regiment of New Jersey Militia, who actually was a brother-in-law of that man who was his first owner of time. So he was back among people that he had known as a kid when he was in the militia after being in the Continental Army. Now, he not only served at the Battle of Trenton, he also served at the Battle of Monmouth in the militia this time under Captain Snook. And again, that quote is from his pension application, where he says, "We were there, but we were stationed a little bit away from the main action, so we didn't thoroughly engage the enemy." I think it's important that he said it that way and didn't try to make a big deal out of what he did there. A lot of veterans did that, but he's obviously a very honest man. He's accounting for where he was, but not trying to overplay it in any way. By 1789, when he was 35 years old, he was now ready to marry and start a family. He had put it off because he wanted to be able to support a family well. He wanted to do well in life. The woman he enslaved, Mary, owned by Nathaniel Hunt from today's Lawrence Township, was an enslaved woman. He had to buy her from her owner and work that, negotiate that with Nathaniel Hunt. And he actually sold her to Jacob on their wedding day. Interesting wedding situation. The wedding was actually attended by both the Hunt family and Jacob Francis. Nathaniel Hunt owned other slaves, by the way, too, not just Mary. About 1801, Jacob and Mary moved to near Flemington. He's still going to be a farmer. He's not going to live in the village of Flemington just yet. But he does join the Flemington Baptist Church in 1805, your church. And it was an interesting process that he went through to be baptized into membership there, both he and Mary. We find tax records from the time that he was joining the church. He owned 115 acres now of improved land. That means he was farming it. It wasn't just forest or wasteland or anything like that. It was real farmland. Notice in the tax book with his name, Jacob Francis, a black, okay? It was not uncommon at all to have by his name that he was colored, that he was black, that he was in some way different from white. Okay. Now, this is a map on the left there of Flemington about 1822. And just to orient you to it, that's Main Street running north and south. That's Church Street, which I think you all know. And of course, what was the church? It was the Baptist Church. But notice on the map, the Baptist Church in 1822 is facing Church Street, and it's a little bit back from Main Street. There's another house right in the corner there, on the corner of Main and Church. Guess who? That's the Jacob Francis house. Right now, it's probably about the place where the front steps to the church are. So every time you go into church, you're walking over the former land of Jacob Francis and kind of walking through the airspace of his house. And he lived there from about 1820 until he died in 1836, and Mary lived there until 1844. And the children that Ken is going to be talking about, were born either before they moved into that house. In fact, most of them were, but some of them spent their childhood in that house. Now, during the 1820s, they're attending the Baptist Church there in Flemington, and their minister was Charles Bartlett, who was a leading voice for abolition, but also for the colonization of free black people in Africa. So Jacob and his family had to, keep hearing about how they weren't really wanted, that they should go back to Africa. And their minister is doing that. I think that's important when you take a look at the life of his son Abner, whom Ken's going to be talking about, because he would have been a young man in the 1820s and thinking about his future life also. In 1832 is when Jacob applied for his pension. And notice again here in the pension, the court reporter who took his information down had to stop. He said, Jacob Francis, an aged 78-year-old man, he has to actually go back and put in a colored man. Again, sign of the times there. And notice also that Jacob was not literate. He could not write his name. He just made his mark. In March of 1836, he dictated his will, which was very extensive. He had a number of children that I think Ken is going to talk to you about. And again, he had to sign with his mark. He died then in July of 1836, and he got a pretty decent obituary in the local newspaper, the Hunter and Gazette, that commented on his 30-year membership in your Baptist church there, the fact that he had raised a large family in a very fine fashion that the people respected, and that he was known for his work in the Revolution, in the military, both in the Continental Army and the militia, with great regard by the people who had worked with him. And in fact, just in his life in Flemington, he had earned the respect of everyone. So this is really a fairly long obituary for the time, and indicates that he did have that respect. An inventory was made of his effects for that little house on the church, what's now the church property there. He indicates that it was a kind of a modest middle-class lifestyle. He was not in abject poverty, although he was applying for a pension because he felt the need for it. His wife lived on until 1844 and then died at the same place. Her obituary notice, on the other hand, again, the difference between men and women at this time, it basically was a sentence and said that she was a colored woman who died at an advanced age. You know, Jacob got all this stuff about specifics about his life, but she didn't. I would love to know much more about her, because I think she was a very interesting woman, and I think her story would be wonderful to know. But that's the story of Jacob and Mary in brief, and I hope you'll have some questions for me later on. But right now I'm going to turn over to Ken and hope that he's able to fill you in with the next generation, and then we'll come back to the questions.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen here. And let's see if you can, do you see my entire screen or just the slides?
Full screen.
Full screen. Okay, so good afternoon. Thanks, Larry, for that excellent presentation. I'm Ken Hawkins, and Larry sort of overviewed how we met. We sort of converged in our paths of research and ended up meeting at the church and having this wonderful discovery. I'm retired from the National Archives and Records Administration as an archivist and a program manager. And so I sometimes tend to sort of obsess over the artifacts themselves, the records. But thanks to, as Larry pointed out, the application that Jacob and then Mary made for pensions for his Revolutionary War service, he gave this very detailed affidavit, and a lot of the details that we have about their lives derive from that. And so I always appreciate that aspect of the story. And Abner, or A.H., and his brother Isaac were two free blacks who were well known to me in my home state of Oregon as merchants and activists in Portland, Oregon Territory in the 1850s, who founded one of the most successful mercantile and dry goods and clothing establishments on the main street of Portland, Oregon in the town's founding decade of the 1850s. And little did I know that he actually had this very long and interesting career as a free black abolitionist in the state of New York and in New Jersey. And the more I dug into the story, the more fascinating it became. And his circle of friends included a whole host of prominent black abolitionists working in that area, including Frederick Douglass. And so he took his life experiences from Jersey and New York and applied them to what he saw going on around him, and made a place in history. If you are interested in sort of more details, there's a website called the Oregon Encyclopedia, and if you go there, you'll find an entry, sort of an online encyclopedia of Oregon history, an entry that I wrote on the two brothers, Isaac and Abner. And I tend to refer to them by their initials only because that's how they signed most of their letters and documents. I have a feeling that they wanted to go by those. So as I dug into the research, I'll just sort of go kind of over the highlights. We're talking about the Abner and then Isaac here, who are the third and seventh sons, respectively, that we know of Jacob and Mary Frances. the listing of the children is derived from the pension applications, from Jacob's will, and also from later on there was a lawsuit in the 1860s when two of the siblings, one of the siblings, Nathaniel, sued for title to a property in Buffalo. And in the course of that, he identified all the living siblings as of that point, which was actually quite helpful from a kind of a family history standpoint. So the family.
What time is it now?
The family. Could folks who aren't speaking mute their devices? Thank you.
Quarter of.
Interestingly, the witnesses who came in to support when Mary applied for a widow's pension after Jacob died in 1836, 2 years later, she applied for a widow's pension for his service. And among the witnesses to that was her enslaver's son. Nathaniel Hunt was the person who enslaved her in Mercer County, just to the south. And his son came and vouched and provided some of those details about the wedding, date and place. And he identified his birthday as 1780, and that he was the son of Nathaniel Hunt. And then also, interestingly, in also among the people who came and supported the affidavit for her pension was Peter Howard, or Hayward, who was a merchant in Flemington. And on the map on the right here, you can see the intersection there. Larry was showing where the Francis house was. Even in 1851, Peter Hayward still lives there. And in 1829, he sold the lot on the corner there to Jacob Francis for their home and residence. He was obviously a person who didn't have an issue with selling property to a free black. So it was just interesting to me that he shows up quite a bit after the period that Jacob was alive. In their lives in New Jersey at the time, as Larry noted, Mary was emancipated on her wedding day to Jacob, but slavery was not completely eradicated from New Jersey at the time. And indeed, when Nathaniel Hunt left his will and testament years later in 1811, I guess 10 years after they had moved to Flemington, he did include slaves as property in the distribution of his estate in 1811. And when his son, Samuel, who was the one who supported Mary's affidavit, died in the 1840s, his estate included the unexpired terms of 2 indentured servants. So unfree labor and indeed enslavement was not uncommon. And even in New Jersey, well into the early 19th century. So, and other, the compulsory and often violent nature was also ever present. In the course of, one of the things I was trying to do was find out more information about Mary's enslavement, if I could find documentation of her emancipation or any other information. But I came across a case in 1792 where Samuel Hunt in Maidenhead and his wife were indicted for manslaughter for beating to death a young black enslaved woman of theirs on their property right off the main street in Maidenhead, which made the newspapers and made the state records. And they were indicted, but there was no record I could find of a trial or disposition of that case. And there was a lot of detail. So whether or not this was a Samuel Hunt that was, apparently it was an older Samuel Hunt, but whether or not it was in the same family, it was evidence that there was significant violence associated with slavery in the area, and this would be something that they were certainly aware of. And as they carried forward, the legacy of that injustice, I think, stuck with the children, certainly with Abner, himself. The other interesting aspect, if I think Larry alluded to it earlier, though I'll just make one last point here, is that both Nathaniel and Abner's middle name was Hunt. So two of the sons actually appeared to have taken names that were names used by the family that enslaved Mary Frances, which is as yet unexplained. The other aspect that I would note quickly is that both Asa Francis, born 1805, and then Abner, both the first US Census that recorded race on a per individual basis was the 1850 census, and then that was carried on in 1860. They, both of those census listed Abner and Asa as mulatto or mixed race. And the 1850 census also identified Abner's wife as mixed race as well, which speaks to some of the dynamics and the relationships ongoing in slavery. So Abner's career as an abolitionist in the 1830s and 40s across both New Jersey and New York, his argument essentially was that of the similar argument that Frederick Douglass and others use, is that they appealed to the legacy of rights and freedom won in the Revolution. Abner could literally point to his father's own service in the Revolution as his commitment to the United States, and that he had fought for and won rights that he was essentially still waiting for in his day-to-day life. The other aspect of their argument against slavery, or as far as a mechanism for addressing it, there was not that many options open. There was obviously some discussion about whether force or persuasion was the best way, and they basically elevated an ideology of respectability. That is, they said that in order to be respected and accorded rights, we need to educate ourselves, uplift ourselves through economic improvement, through schooling, through hard work, through honesty, and essentially adopt the moral sort of values of the broader white culture, which paid a significant amount of attention to the concept of respectability and honor and reputation. And so you find Francis, Douglass, Gibbs, Delaney, and other Black abolitionists making this argument, and arguing indeed too, and this was a significant turn in Douglass's thought that Francis had some role in, arguing that the Constitution itself, rather than condoning slavery, could actually be used as a lever in the argument for full rights for Black Americans. And so that was one aspect of his concern about colonization that Larry referred to, is that the notion there was a significant white abolitionist sort of argument that American slaves should be removed from the United States and resettled in colonies in countries outside the United States, and especially in climates that they thought they would be more suited to. And Francis's response to that was, why should they leave? When they were born in the United States, they fought for America's freedom, and the notion that they should be forcibly removed to some other foreign country was just on the face of it really offensive, frankly. So he was, from the various earliest documentation of Francis's abolitionist argument and career, he is staunchly anti-colonization. As part of his mode of sort of making his way in the world, his parents sent apparently all the children to common school for their education. He excelled in mathematics and business, and so he undertook a career in mercantile business, and specifically tailoring and fashionable clothing. So he emigrated to Buffalo on the far end of the Erie Canal in 1835, and opened a retail store there, which operated for the next 15 years in Buffalo, and at one point was bringing in upwards of $70,000 per year. And their specialty was the latest fashion in terms of cravats and vests and men's clothes and women's clothes, and their advertisements have these long lists of all the fashionable fabrics and silk and whatnot you could buy at their store in Buffalo. At the same time, both he and his partner were active abolitionists in New York State. Of course, Buffalo is on the far western side of the state. The next big city to the east is Rochester. And when Frederick Douglass moved to Rochester in 1847, that really sort of was at the same time that their work together accelerated. They had first met in 1843, and of course, at the time, Douglass was younger and was starting out his career in the late 1830s and early 1840s, and he was just one of several colleagues that Francis had, including William Qualls and his business partner Robert Banks and James W. Garrett, all of whom were also at the same time active abolitionists in Rochester and Buffalo, and even beyond that area. They worked under considerable risks, but they also took advantage of opportunities. That is, there was significant backlash to the abolition movement, and if you read the history of sort of the response to abolitionists, one of the things that happened frequently was that there were anti-Black riots in major cities where whole neighborhoods of Black residents were burned out, were driven out of town. There was a notorious one in Cincinnati. Francis was well aware of these and actually wrote about being fearful for his life in 1838 when a rumor started in Buffalo against the free Blacks there, and he raised a petition and spoke out against it. But there was fairly active resistance as well, both in the church that they founded in Buffalo on Michigan Avenue as a stop on the Underground Railroad, and then also with helping folks get north to Canada in the church that they attended in Buffalo, which actually is still standing. One of the other things going on, of course, in 1850 was both the Fugitive Slave Act made it more dangerous for free Blacks living in the North who could be kidnapped and brought down to the South and sold into slavery, even if they had papers showing that they were free. And then also California was admitted as a free state. So if you look at the pages of Frederick Douglass's newspaper and the other newspapers, they were cognizant of what was going on in the West and that a free state had opened. So there was this tradition of immigration to the West as being a opportunity and an option for free Blacks. That is, Francis himself moved from New Jersey to Western New York, which really was on sort of was the jumping off point for all the markets for wheat and corn further to the West. And then in 1850, 51, Robert Banks, his former partner, moved to California, and then in 1851, Francis went ahead and immigrated himself to California. I just had a couple of quotes here in terms of the argument that he made for abolition, that Francis himself wrote, "Our fathers had fought, bled, and died for the liberties of this country, that we might have equal rights with other citizens, and that they would never, ever be forced from the shores of America." So his ability with words and with argument was quite impressive and quite forceful, and fit in with the mainstream of other abolitionists at the time. As a little sort of bonus thing, as far as Flemington, I came across an article in the 100 in History newsletter from the Historical Society that pointed to this photograph, which I then found a version of out in the sort of a web graveyard for an eBay auction from years ago that I was not aware of, long before I was doing this research, for an unidentified photograph of Frederick Douglass taken in Flemington in 1888. I kind of dug in. I've not been able to find another copy of this photograph yet, or to get a better scan of it. But Douglass visited in 1888 while he was on a speaking tour for New Jersey Republicans, and apparently spoke at the courthouse in Flemington. And he must have known that his old friend Abner Francis came from there. He often would take photos with well-wishers and supporters. And so we know that his Nathaniel Francis's family still resided in Flemington at the time, and that especially his son David was living there at the time. So it's not definitive, but the photo was taken in Flemington. It possibly could be one of the Francis descendants there. It's just, we need some more research on that. So when they lived in Buffalo, when he moved to Buffalo a few years later, he met Sidna Dandridge, who was the daughter of John and Charlotte Dandridge, who were formerly enslaved in Virginia and moved to Buffalo in the mid 1830s. They were married by 1837. And they lived in the sort of area east of Main Street in Buffalo. And one of the first things they participated in was founding the Second Baptist Church, which is also known as the Michigan Street Baptist Church, on Michigan, just south of Broadway, and it's still standing. It was built in 1845, and then their tailor shop was in the downtown area, right on the Erie Canal terrace in the main part of downtown. They did have a daughter, Theodosia, which was the name that was common in Hunterdon County earlier, but and I guess throughout other parts of the United States at the point. But it's unclear. Information about Theodosia is very, very sketchy. It's unclear. She may have been born in the early 1840s, although she's still referred to as a child on ship passenger lists that I found in the 1850s when they're out in Oregon. So it's unclear when exactly she was born, and it's also unclear when she died. So he immigrates to Oregon in 1851 and lives there for the next 10 years. And upon his arrival in Oregon, his brother is arrested under a territorial law that excluded Blacks from residence in the Oregon Territory. And he is brought before a judge and ordered to leave Oregon within 4 months. So Abner gets to work. He knows well how to write up a petition, how to lobby in a political sense. So he retains the counsel of a lawyer, and they write up a petition and get over 200 white Oregonians to sign a petition that basically calls for the rescinding of the Exclusion Act, or at least amending it so that respectable, honorable businessmen like the Francis brothers can stay in Oregon. And the petition is brought to the territorial legislature in December of 1851 and is considered briefly, but then it's tabled and there's no action taken. There's no record of any formal disposition of it, but indeed the brothers remain in Oregon. Their store flourishes. They live their life for the next 10 years running the store on the principal commercial block of the city of Portland, and blending in with society. And it's an interesting achievement. At the same time, he carries on with writing letters to Frederick Douglass, who publishes them both in the North Star and Frederick Douglass's paper. He writes, I believe it is 20 letters altogether are published by Douglass from Francis, and 5 of those are from California in the 1850s, and then 13 of them are from Oregon. And so they give you really a great firsthand view of what life was like for a free Black in what he called in one letter, this new but rotten arm of the Republic. And part of the reason for that was because even though Oregon was ostensibly a free territory, the prejudice was systemic, was widespread against Blacks, and they suffered from it pretty much right when they landed. And then he goes on to detail in these letters other examples of it through the 1850s. And the same is true in California. And part of the reason why they were so concerned was, especially after the Kansas-Nebraska Nebraska Act of 1854, it rescinded the Missouri Compromise, which had formerly limited the expansion of slavery to below the 3630 parallel. In this map, you can see all the area in red, which is the territories at the time. Those were all opened to slavery. That is, if the local residents voted to approve it, essentially the legal restrictions against slavery in those areas was open, which meant that even Oregon and even potentially the state of California, there was concern that slavery could expand, and that there was certainly a push for that. There was an open push for the expansion of slavery into Oregon. So this was highly concerning to Francis and to others, and of course was commonly seen as one of the sort of fuses that was lit in the mid-1850s that helped bring on the Civil War. So in the course of that period, their conditions were bad enough that when the Francises moved from New York to they came across the isthmus, came to California, they essentially set up a base in San Francisco, bought property there, resided there. The evidence is that Sidna and her daughter resided in San Francisco, and the parents all through the mid-1850s. And then they essentially ran the business by just doing steamboat trips back and forth, living above their store in Portland, and then but actually maintaining residence in California, where it was better. It wasn't great for Blacks, and in fact, conditions got to the point by 1858 that there was a large-scale immigration of free Blacks from California up to Victoria, British Columbia. The governor of the province invited Blacks, let them know, literally came down to San Francisco in 1858, attended several church meetings at Black churches, and invited Blacks to come to Canada and Victoria because they could become citizens, and once they became citizens, they could vote or run for office. And so there was a large immigration starting from San Francisco area, and then because of the Francises' ties to that area, to San Francisco, they joined in this immigration. First, the Dandridges moved to Victoria in 1858, and then I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but then the Francises moved there. So Francis actually flourished in Portland during the 1850s to the point where by 1858, when this lithograph was published of the city, showing the most prominent residences and business houses, his shop is shown right here on the principal block on Front Street in Portland, and his store, his name is on the sign to the store here, and he was reporting net worth in the range of $25,000, which was frankly almost in the same range as some of the more well-known sort of so-called founders of Portland. He's not often mentioned in the histories of Portland, but they ran a business here on Front Street, first in this white building, the Columbian Hotel at Front and Washington. It's now called Nadeau Parkway is the name of the main street on Portland. And this is looking north during the flood of 1862, and Francis's brick store is just right back here in the corner. I have a copy of the petition that was submitted to the legislature for them, and then later on, after they had stayed, the brothers would put little references to abolition in their advertisements, even using the popular phrase "Still They Come" was from a abolition song that was sung at meetings across the East. They were frequent travelers on steamboats, and including the Peytona and some of the other prominent steamboats. As I mentioned, they moved to Victoria in 1861 and lived there for another 10 years, joining that Black diaspora to Canada. Brought their daughter with them, baptized their daughter, and then Francis was a supporter of the Victoria Pioneer Rifles, which was an all-Black militia group that was set up in the early 1860s in Victoria to protect the city and to support what's the word? To evidence their support of the Queen and of the government. And so many Blacks who were American immigrants actually became Canadian citizens, and that included Francis, who became a citizen of Canada in 1863. This photograph, it's a little hard to see, but he may be in this photograph. He was a civilian supporter, financial and organizational supporter of the militia group. And he may be in this photograph, not in uniform, but he may be one of these gentlemen right here. And life in Victoria was also challenging, but at least he did have the right to vote and to own property there, which had not been so much the case in Oregon. I had to rush through this, but I wanted to let you know that I have an article on Abner Francis and his letters to Frederick Douglass, which will be coming out in the Oregon Historical Quarterly in this winter 2020 issue of the letters he wrote. We chose 9 of them to annotate and include all the context and sort of source documentation, and then a number of historic illustrations of his life on the Oregon Territory, and essentially being a businessman on the ground in Oregon and being an abolitionist in print with Frederick Douglass at the same time. So he had a interesting life. So thank you very much for listening, and I think Larry and I can certainly take questions.
First, I'd like to thank you, both of you, for doing this presentation, because history is important and it really gives context to where we are in this country, and then just to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the importance of that. I think this kind of opened our eyes, and I think, you know, everybody should be intentional in teaching their children this history, you know, and the importance. It's not about, you know, who was wrong or right. Like you said, you know, the attitude to resistance. It's an attitude we now have to take as a country and move forward in terms of how we tell the stories, you know, because we each have stories, but this is very profound, very telling. And I thank both of you for actually, you know, doing this presentation and really laying out the history. My heart is warm to hear all of what you have just presented. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Daryl here. I know several of us at the church were curious how the land transferred over to the church property. I don't know if you covered that already, but could you touch that again?
Ken, do you know that?
Yeah, I started going down that I like to call them rabbit holes, because you can just spend hours. But the FamilySearch.org, which is from the Latter-day Saints Church part of Ancestry anyway, they have the deeds all online, and you have to sort of go through them very deliberately, because they're not completely digitized. But in any case, the son Nathaniel, who we focused on a bit, he was the executor to Jacob's estate. And so that administration sort of went through the 1840s, and I found the deed, which I can share with you all, where he sold it to the first person. He sold it to a private party in the 1840s for several $1,000s. And he himself owned a fairly large amount of property around Flemington in different locations. And from there, so I had her name, which of course now I'm forgetting, but he sold it to a woman after Mary died in 1844. So I believe it's 45 or 46 is the time when he sold it to the first party. And then from there, it was unclear to me. I had not followed it, the custody trail, all the way to when the church first got it. I'm guessing the church was obviously already founded by that time, but I was not having good luck with the indexes yet. So that part of the story is still in development. That is, we need to find the deed between the church, and the private party. So there was some lag. It didn't go directly from the Francises to the church. I think there was at least one person in between. So as I get that information, I'll share it with Larry and with you all going forward.
I believe this is Jim Slovak, that you had mentioned that there was a considerable amount of history in the Hunterdon Historical Society from Flemington Baptist Church. I think you mentioned particularly a large book that had a lot of our church history that's there. And one of the things that interested me earlier and during our talk in the parking lot was that the resistance to allowing Jacob to join the church. And I was wondering if possibly you could just elaborate on that, because to me, it's just fascinating because it's such a different time than today. I mean, we still have problems, but compared to the inequities of today versus, back then, it's just so much different, and it was almost a different world. And it's amazing to me that he would face this kind of resistance. I'd like to learn more about that.
Yeah, in many ways, he was welcomed to the church, but when he first applied and first went through the, making his statement of religious belief and that kind of thing to earn baptism, that was accepted. There was no problem. However, he was denied admittance to the church initially because a member, one of the white members, accused him of an illegal or some kind of a transaction problem, had done something dastardly to this man, in a transaction. It turned out to be just a quantity of rye, the wheat rye. But that kept him out for a couple of months. But then that got resolved when they found out and investigated that it had been more a problem through a distributor and the records of that distributor rather than Jacob himself, that had been the problem. So that clarified things. But your point that, it was one of those really iffy kinds of complaints to make, and why they would make it, was it because he was a black man and they wanted to resist him? Or was this guy just in a bad mood? It's really hard to tell. But when you look at the situation, it was very much like today. There were a lot of people in Flemington who befriended the Francises, and they were very well accepted. But then there were other instances where they weren't, and it basically boiled down to that. Having to put colored or black after their name, in virtually every document, and even in the church book, that was that way too, by the way.
Yeah, and it's when you take that, and then if you look at the chronology in Portland and Victoria too, it literally was, they arrived in Portland in August of 1851, and 2 weeks later, Isaac is arrested under the Exclusion Act, and they're basically ordered to leave because they're black. When they move then Isaac dies in 1856, Abner takes over the business. They go on for another couple of years, actually are able to buy property in Portland. But there's so much sort of blowback against him in the press and elsewhere. And then what was going on in California to cause this sort of migration. It was within a week of when they arrived in Victoria that he actually was arrested for debts that he owed in San Francisco, and then fought for several years. And there was just numerous examples of white pushback against their living in Victoria and daring to vote and run for office. And it's disheartening on one hand to see the ongoing pushback, but at the same time they continue to fight it and to persist and to believe in the rights and the liberties that were promised in the American Revolution. It's really inspiring to see that dedication to freedom and liberty on the part of these folks.
Another thing that really struck me was you mentioned how our preacher at the time that Jacob joined was speaking in favor of recolonizing Africa, I guess, sending the blacks back. And, I guess for me, of course, that's very disappointing to hear, that was the position. And perhaps that was a common position back then. And
it was very common among the early abolitionists, yeah. Yeah, when you hear the word abolition, you think this is positive. But when you realize abolition did not mean acceptance, it meant no slavery, but then you get out of here, kind of thing. It wasn't as equalizing as it appeared to be.
Right. And it's interesting too that, on the timeline there, that was happening. It's only a few years later when Abner's in New Jersey, so before he moves to New York, he's active in the Trenton abolitionist scene, and he's an agent for William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator. And of course, Garrison and his group were one of the main advocates in opposition to the colonization scheme. So in fact, one of the strongest statements that you get from Francis, that one I quoted where he's talking about the revolution, is at a meeting in Trenton opposing colonization. So he must have, seen that going on in his own church and said, no, I'm not going to go for that.
And when he made that statement, he was very young.
Yes, in his 20s, right?
He was in his early 20s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is Pastor Phyllis. Thank you so very, very much. One of the points that I made in my sermon this morning, that freedom is something that we sometimes take for granted. And so here we see in this presentation that freedom is on both sides of the equation. And freedom is something that is given to individuals, but freedom is something that is given to the oppressors too, because they are bound up even when they are oppressing. So thank you so much for this presentation.
This is Lois at the church. I wanted to know, were there any female siblings from Mary and Jacob? You talk about the men all the time. Were there any female?
I'll let you get on.
Yeah,
There were. I was say two.
There were two siblings. There were two female siblings that I found listed in the I believe it's actually in his will, is when Phoebe and the other woman are named. And then also, but that's the only time they show up, and we just don't know anything about them. The other female of interest to many people, and I find her fascinating, is Sidna. First of all, she's got this amazing name. She's got two middle names, and that Abner married in Buffalo, and she was actually very active in the kind of social scene in Buffalo against slavery and for women's improvement. And she moves to California. So she's writing letters to Douglas that are printed in the North Star, et cetera. And I'd love to know more about her family. I think there's plenty of opportunity for more research here to find out more about these folks too.
Yeah, I just want to say on top of that, keep in mind, both Ken and I are continuing to research. We don't feel like we've gotten anywhere near the end of it, at this point.
Yeah, especially with the archives being closed and having to do most of our research now. So we're at the mercy of what's been digitized and put online and maybe appears in the newspapers. But I think once we get past the pandemic, we probably both will be found down at the state archives probably for days on end, digging into sources down there.
Were Nathaniel and his family members of the Flemington Baptist Church?
Yes.
They were?
Yes. They're in the records also as being buried in the cemetery there.
It showed the stones, but Nathaniel and his wife, and then how many children did they have?
I'm not sure because I haven't checked all that out yet. It was at least 4, I think.
Uh-huh. Did they stay in this general area or did they disperse to
I would love to know what the children did. Yeah, I haven't been able to get to that yet. And I don't know if Ken has or not, but
Yeah, I think just based on the tombstones of David Francis, who was Nathaniel's son,
Yeah.
and then Hannah, I think was a daughter named after her mother. They're both buried there. So at least two of the children stayed around long enough to live life and to
one of them died rather young, as I remember.
yeah.
And
Like
how
yeah.
children of Jacob and Mary and the children of Nathaniel and his wife, how were they educated at that time?
Well, for Jacob, that's something that I'm really trying to pin down. There was not a lot of opportunity for free Black kids to get an education. In Flemington, there were people who, helped kids, almost like tutoring them. There were, with the churches, there were Sunday schools that were actually more than Sunday school. They were more literate school. There were some early attempts, but I can't pin down from what I've seen of exactly how the kids of Jacob were educated. By the time you get to Nathaniel's kids, education is a little bit easier and there's a little bit more opportunity for it. But Jacob's kids, that's a very interesting issue that I've got to deal more with and see if I can find some things on.
Yeah, the main reason we know that they went to school, there's a single source from a July 1863 profile of Abner that was published in a newspaper called the Pacific Appeal in San Francisco that was edited by a friend of his, a Black abolitionist who originated in New York, was friend of Douglass and et cetera, ran this newspaper in San Francisco. And so in that, he gives a biographical sketch of Abner and says that he and his siblings were given a good English schooling by their parents in Flemington. So, but in terms of where they went, if it was a formal school with a schoolhouse, we don't know yet. They were certainly literate though. I mean, it's pretty clear early on. I mean, the first record we have of Abner outside of a census record or anywhere is he's serving as a secretary to an abolition meeting in 1831. And so he's 19 years old and he's charged with, taking the notes of the meeting and writing them up and getting them in the newspaper. So that was particularly interesting, I thought.
And when you read his letters, I mean, he is a very well-educated man. Yeah.
Yeah.
His use of the English language is sophisticated, and just his thought processes and understanding of things, the fact that he's very knowledgeable about a lot of different areas, he's really top notch.
Yeah, and it's one of the elusive aspects is we don't know what they look like. There is no identified photograph of Abner H. Francis, much less any of the others, apart from the closest thing we have is copies of his signature. But he was living in an area where there was photographers available, where especially in Rochester and Buffalo, Douglass was actually the most photographed man in the 19th century. And those cabinet cards, people would buy those and have them, on display in their homes. So, and then I know that where he lived in Portland, he was literally right next door to the leading photographer in the city of Portland in the 1850s, who was taking portraits of leading citizens. So somewhere there, I know in my heart, there's a photograph of him waiting to be identified, maybe in Victoria, maybe in an attic up in Flemington somewhere, through the Nathaniel family connection. So more digging.
My name is Kenneth Cummings, and I certainly have appreciated being allowed to hear this program today. Lois Stewart called me yesterday and alerted me to this program, and so I want to compliment Dr. Hawkins and Larry on the research that they've done on a Flemington family, and I want to just say that I would hope that certainly when you complete or flesh out the rest of the research on this, that we can invite you back to present this maybe to the Hunterdon County Historical Society. I think there were a lot of people in the county that would love to have heard this today and didn't know about it. And I've certainly enjoyed listening to you, and thank you for presenting this program.
Ken, thank you very much. I am in touch with the Hunterdon County Historical Society. I know Dave, and I've known other people that have been associated with the archives there and everything. And I'm just waiting to get back in. And
Thank you. I know that, Larry.
As soon as they open up again. And
we hope to be
Dave
open again. And
Dave does want me to do a talk for the Historical Society
right
in the future. So it'll be coming. And I'm also hoping to get a book together on it. So
we'll look forward to that.
Ken, a very fascinating thing that you said, I believe it was when AH made it to Oregon, perhaps Portland, that he or his partner, I'm not completely clear, was arrested basically for trying to live in that state as a Black person. Could you just, was that a common thing? I guess you're investigating the history of Oregon, and I just want to know, like, a little more about that.
There was a law passed in 1844 and then renewed in 1849, and this is before Oregon became a state. And then, of course, the Oregon Constitution in 1859 pretty much put that phrase or that clause into the Constitution that essentially said that Blacks who did not already live there could not emigrate to Oregon, own property, or vote. And so it pretty much excluded them from the most important rights that Americans have. And so what happened is they arrived, got a store leased, they got a property to lease in Portland. And this is the founding year of Portland, actually. It's, 1851 is, so he's one of the founders of Portland, and he's not in any of the histories, which is kind of frustrating, and we're going to fix that. But he did, they both arrived, they're on the passenger list for arriving in August of 1851, and then Admiral was called back to San Francisco 2 weeks later. And while he was gone, his brother someone reported him under the Exclusion Act of 1849, and he was arrested and brought before a judge who essentially looked him up and down and said, "Are you Black?" And he said, "Well, yes, I am." And he said, "Okay, you're in violation of the law," and gave him, I think, 30 days or so. It was appealed to the Supreme Court of the territory, and the Supreme Court upheld the ruling for them and gave them 4 months, which was technically longer than allowed, but gave them enough time to write up that petition. And it reminded me of what Larry was saying earlier, is that some parts of the story, like, we don't know who reported them, who was the plaintiff in the case. There's actually no court record of the case because the records were so poorly kept in those days, and the courts themselves were held in meeting halls, in schoolhouses, under oak trees, etc. They would do this kind of, why they called it a circuit. It was almost like a circuit rider. The judges would go around to the different geographic areas. So in any case, the way we know about this case is from Abner's letter to Frederick Douglass, which was published in Frederick Douglass's newspaper, which is included in my article, the entire text of the letter. And then also the petition, which ended up in the state archives, because otherwise there's no newspaper notice of it. There's no apparent court record of it. But it sort of shows you that, people weren't as good about keeping all the records perhaps as they were later on, and that there's probably more digging to do in some of the local courthouses out in Oregon. It's just a matter of getting out there and being able to do it safely.
I guess, from our modern sensibilities point of view, this is, to me, just so jaw-dropping and amazing that is a type of things that, you had to deal with at that time frame. Pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And I guess, oversimplified thought of history, the North are the good guys and the South are the, slavery holders, but it was much more muddled than that. And you could see from this talk that even up well into 1840s and 50s, we still had these type of issues right in New Jersey. I guess it was not clear at all. And,
yeah, it's very complex.
yeah, and certainly shocking to me. You know, we all think of George Washington as a hero, and you know, to oppose black men joining to fight for the country is just seemingly so surprising. That not until that they actually need the people and to prevent them from joining the other side do they finally change. And I guess that's, you know, the times have changed quite a bit, I guess, and it's you know, remarkable to learn, you know, these things. So thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.